This is In Time, a music history podcast. On this show, we examine the shared links between music, art, literature, philosophy, science, and every aspect of culture, because it's all connected. Join us this week to see how our artistic heritage is influenced by what came before it and where it could possibly go next. Before we begin, in my sense last week that the epitaph of Sekilos being the most appropriate place to stop and leave some well-meaning words of wisdom, I completely forgot the fact that the episode was supposed to make it to the fall of the Roman Empire. So, briefly, without getting into the historical differences between, say, 100 AD and 473,
I think so. That seems right.
that seems about right. If it's not, forgive me, I'm not a historian, no matter how much I try sometimes. The thing you need to know about music, because this period of the late Roman Empire is where we finally, in the West, get some music that we still have.
Right, that we would recognize today as music and not as something else.
Especially if you were into the rave scene in the 1990s and you thought, it'd be a great idea. Let's buy this recording of a bunch of monks chanting. Dead serious. #1 album, 1999. Yeah. What? For real.
That's wild. Absolutely wild.
But what the early Christians give us is a form of music known as plain chant.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just realizing that I forgot my keyboard today, but don't worry, we can fix that.
Oh no.
The Middle Ages, however, are normally described as a bleak period in Western history. And there's pretty good reason for that.
Yeah, I don't think that's completely off base. I do think it's very important to note that the Middle Ages, or the Dark Ages as they are sometimes referred to in Western history, was a very dark time for Western history. The Middle East was thriving during that time period.
Yeah. But, I don't know what we'd call it if we were approaching this from the Eastern viewpoint.
Yeah, I don't know.
I don't either. Anyway.
Again, we focus on Western history and culture because that is what we know.
Yep.
It is important always to acknowledge that it is not the only thing that exists.
Wait. What?
Hey, you joke, but there are some jackasses out there, man.
That's fair. So, on the surface level, we do have, plague, famine, prejudice, inquisitions,
etc.
We also get knights and courtly love and chivalry, all the things the romantics really like to talk about. But in actuality, this period is really rich in detail, and there was a thriving culture. But the reason why we normally refer to it as the Dark Ages is because it is comparatively dark in terms of advancement in comparison to the Western Roman Empire.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the Eastern Roman Empire, for all they were concerned, as the Byzantines, as we call them today, they were still Rome. Rome did not fall until the 1400s, even though the last thing to fall was Constantinople. The last years of the Byzantine Empire were literally just the city of Constantinople.
Now called Istanbul.
Istanbul's Constantinople. There we go.
And that's all we can sing without getting copyright stricken.
This is true.
Hey, they might be giants. Love you.
Thank you. I thought it was older than that.
What?
That song?
No, that's They Might Be Giants.
Oh, okay.
If I'm wrong, shout me out, but Anyway, sorry. Very sorry.
Because we have moved past the deeply felt sense of religiosity and superstition of this time period, we tend to look on this era as being very primitive and very unmodern. But beneath that wall of austerity is a deeply held belief in the unity of music, art, philosophy, and religion. This is In Time, a music history podcast. I'm your host, Zachary Singer.
I'm Susan Zeringer.
Welcome to the show, and let's just dive in. The collapse of the Roman Empire obviously is a slow process, and we're not going to delve into every little tit-for-tat thing that happened to Rome.
I'd leave.
I would leave too. I don't have that mental capacity today, as though I do find that period to be fascinating, as most periods. The only thing I don't like is the Gilded Age.
That's fair.
Anyway.
It's not for everybody.
It is safe to say, though, that the fall of the Roman Empire was not a singular event, but rather a drawn-out process that encompassed at least a century. But over the span of about 100 years or so, the greatest empire the world had ever seen was no more. What was left in its stead was essentially the regions of Germany, France, Spain, Britain to a certain extent, as well as a good chunk of northern Africa, which were left up for grabs politically, culturally, and really just about anything else that can get their grubby hands on that territory. For the eastern part of the empire, now retroactively called the Byzantines, as we've already mentioned, it goes on until the 1400s. However, the grand reminders of the old Roman capital, of Rome itself, were there, littered across the continent for all to see, and eventually to wonder how that was built. Because things like dome construction, aqueducts, and even to a certain degree roads.
Yeah, concrete, definitely the construction for long-lasting roads that the Romans had.
They were lost with the empire itself. However, one thing did survive. Christianity.
Hey.
Now, the Christianity of the early, let's say, 500s is not completely different from what we have today. It is
but in many ways.
In many ways, it is a very different religion. And part of that is reflected in the fact that eventually the church will split.
Several times, in fact.
Well, yes. But for 500 years, there is a unified church front. But it's not until that split where music, art, and philosophy really begin to change. This once repressed Jewish sect of a religion had gone on to take over the world, and with it provided a unifying language for areas as different from Spain to Germany, which, if you're just one of those reductionist people that look at the skin color of someone and say, why, they're white, they're European, what does that matter? They're vastly different cultures.
And to be fair, as different as Spain and Germany are, and they also, I mean, the spread of the early church, even in that time period of up to 500 AD, went as far as modern-day Turkey, past the Middle East into northern India as well. I mean, it was... I mean, that's, like, less important for our purposes, but, like, it was a vast...
It was a...
system
of
spread.
Yeah. And with that, we get several points of intersection with the world that existed beforehand. Because, as it turns out, whenever you have a new religion, you gotta change some things to make it palatable to the old religion.
If your idea is to have converts, then yes you do.
One of the first things is by re-relegating certain of the old gods. Zeus, who by this point in time had become Jupiter.
Mm-hmm.
Since he no longer existed in the minds of the Roman people, the Christians were able to latch on to that pre-existing framework, because essentially speaking, the Roman Empire, by the time of Christianity's rise, was essentially atheist. Their belief in the old Greek gods, which they had copied and pasted from the region of Hela, and, just adapted into their own usage, had no longer been relevant to these people. But the Christians were able to latch on to certain imagery. For example, God being an old man in the sky with a long white beard and perfect abs for some reason.
Well, everyone in the Renaissance had perfect abs.
Yeah, that's fair. I'm sure. I know I don't.
You would if someone was painting you in the Renaissance.
Anyway. By the time the empire's collapse, as we've already touched on, the Christian church had spread across the Roman lands and into areas that Rome never occupied.
Mm-hmm.
And its power, however, remained in Rome. But another power source grew in Constantinople. And this is where things get iffy and confusing, and I'm not going to dwell on what became known as the Great Schism. But essentially, the distance between Rome and Constantinople was so great that the Byzantines became influenced by the Greeks rather than the tradition of the Romans. They kept and adapted Greek philosophy, as did the rising caliphate in the Middle East. Now, they didn't enact anything, and they did not add to it, which is why we don't really think about the Byzantines in particular whenever we think about Greek philosophy. But they held on to it. But slowly, those regions became more and more Greek, until eventually the difference between what we now refer to as Catholicism and the Orthodox Church became so great that the heads of both organizations essentially excommunicated one another from their services in very public fashion.
If you ever want just some ridiculous hijinks, you gotta look at the antics of the church pre 1000 AD. Some hilarious nonsense happens.
Now, since the empire had fallen, though, we now have a massive amount of territory that needs to reorganize. Let's put it this way. While she says that in air quotes here, we don't seem to function in pure anarchy. Whenever we have a system that is less centralized than ones that we've become accustomed to in the last, say, 300 years or so, and, I have my own ethical quandaries about how centralized some of our governments have become, especially in the last, year and a half, maybe.
But that's
another story entirely, which I'm not going to go on.
I'd leave.
Yeah, I would too. But I've even forgotten where I was going with that one. Oh dear, it's getting late, everybody.
Large
I'm sure.
Tracts of land that needed to reorganize.
So the reorganization is as much for their sanity as anything else. So as the borders of Europe, as we think of it today, are beginning to get drawn, there are some things that unify these disparate lands as, different from Sweden to Germany to Britain, England at the time, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland. Christianity becomes a binding force in this entire region, to which we normally call this now the Kingdom of Christendom.
Mm-hmm.
And within this kingdom, we have one form of music known as plain chant. If you remember a couple of weeks ago, we discussed the overtone system as well as the pentatonic scale and the regular scale.
Diatonic
scale, yes. It's been a long day. It's
been
very long day. Teaching is hard, everybody.
It's true.
Anyway, you don't need to hear me bitching and moaning. This form of music, this plain chant, is as unified across the continent as the artistic style of the time. And you can't really take away those two objects from one another. But what we can say is that the art that develops in the West during this period of time does have a good trace of Byzantine inside of it, but it also seems to be missing something to our modern eye.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, it seems like we've regressed back to the style of the Egyptians to a certain degree, because now form is distorted. Form of humans, of hands. We seem to lose the ability to draw hands for about 1,000 years.
Hands are very difficult.
We lose the ability to draw cats, but that has more to do with the fact that they're familiar, so therefore cats have to be evil.
Right, and therefore distorted.
For some reason, we decide that Jesus was born perfect and fully formed, even as a baby, so you find a bunch of pictures of baby Jesus with a grown-ass man's face on it.
Yeah, well, it's just like a very small, like, perfect adult man.
Yeah. They've been both.
Yeah. Which was a direct result of that dogma of them taking the concept of Jesus being born perfect, fully man and fully human to a very literal sense.
Mm-hmm. And what we notice looking at this period is just how much veracity is in the religion itself, because it does permeate everyone's life in numerous ways. But on the surface level, it makes sense, because this is a very difficult world that they're inhabiting. Whenever barbarian invaders can come into your farm at any moment and kill everyone you know and take everything you have, or plague could strike, or the Lord could just decide he needs you to double your grain and you don't have any grain because it's a bad year.
Plague took your hired hands.
Yeah. Now, obviously, without us getting too far into these things, there are plenty of things that would drive your average person today to religion. And to just be political for like 5 seconds, if you look at how people are reacting to each other now, it's the same kind of reaction. It might be a secular reaction rather than a religious response, but just listen to the tone of voice that people use to discuss the world today. It's the same mental link. It's just been changed by 1,000 years of human history. But getting back to, music and art here.
What? Talk about music on a music history podcast?
I know.
Since when?
The musical output of Europe during this period of time was essentially solidified as doctrine around the time of the late Roman Empire. Colloquially, we call this Gregorian chant after Pope Gregory.
Same Pope Gregory of the Gregorian calendar.
He didn't actually really write anything.
No, I'm not sure he was specifically responsible for the calendar either.
No.
He just put his name on a bunch of stuff.
Sounds like an interesting person to get to know.
Does he?
Anyway.
I respectfully disagree.
You know.
I think I know too many people like that already.
That's fair. For those who lived and died in the service of their faith, the way they experienced the world was through art and music. Not that they would go around singing these Gregorian chants for themselves. I have no proof of that.
Seems unlikely.
But these works provided space for you to remove yourself. If you've ever stepped foot in a basilica, specifically a basilica, or a great cathedral, you know the experience of walking into a building where the ceiling is 5 stories above your head, and there is glittering images all around on the ceiling that tells a story that you can follow even if you weren't literate, to remind you of where your life is going. And then the music comes in. And the music is very flowing. It is very untampered with. You can hear it and assume the only connection that you could find would be to a babbling brook somewhere.
And just to further that delightful image a little bit, the modern idea that we have of these very old cathedrals being sort of dark and gloomy places is greatly influenced by us seeing those cathedrals with 200, 500, 800 years of build up from wood fires and coal fires being lit inside the building to heat it or to bring light, and the subsequent amount of wear and tear that building has had. When these cathedrals were built, a lot of them were built from marble or limestone, which is typically very light in color, and they were not dark and dingy from the get-go. They were big, bright, impossibly beautiful places.
Mm-hmm. And all of these things provided you the atmosphere to just let go. There is a certain beauty, and the individualist in me is screaming about this one, but there is a certain beauty in being able to let go, meditate on the words of a text, and hear a sermon, maybe in a language you understand, maybe not. I honestly don't know what the Latin reciprocity rate was between your average peasant and the priestly caste. But to know that you were being taken care of, that your soul was going to be taken care of, because you don't know what's on the other side of those doors. And that's part of the reason why the church service develops as it does. We like to look at Puritan New England and say they had 2-hour church services, 3-hour church services on hard wooden chairs. Why would they do that?
They didn't have anything else to do.
Well, organize your soul. And there is a great beauty in that sentiment. One that I'm not sure I'm qualified to even attempt to understand here. But as you're sitting as you are striving towards that ideal, these people are starting to build new structures. As we've crossed the Great Schism and we're hitting into the 12 and 1300s AD, this is when the Gothic era begins, when people begin to build these massive cathedrals, all in the service of their Lord. And we wonder what would drive someone to do that today. To which I would counter your question with, why do we bother to build 1,000 or 10,000 person stadiums for football?
60,000.
Exactly. Why bother? It's because that's what that society held dear.
Because we can.
Yeah. And in these spaces, they hired their artisans to adorn these areas, and hired musicians to write for these spaces. So you get eventually what is known as the various composition schools, starting with the Franco-Flemish, I believe in the 1400s, which does put us a little outside of this timeline here. But they are all writing for specific places. The music of, let's say, Lully was written specifically for the cathedral in which he worked.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the same for just about every court composer. If you can find, if there is still the church or the cathedral or the basilica where they were working in at the time of their life, and play their music in that space, it will make sense in a way that doing it in any other space just might not.
Also, depending on the time, if you can perform it in well temperament instead of equal temperament, it'll be great.
Yeah, that's a different problem. Now, we could go on and on about Christianity being used for reason behind any number of atrocities. And, we do have to mention the Crusades, but more for their aftermath than the actual acts themselves. But I don't want to do that to this faith. I don't want to do this to any faith, really. I don't want to focus on the things that we already talk about. Because you don't need another podcast of someone saying how bad the Christians were in the Middle Ages. we've had a
If you
reformation.
want that, you can find dozens of them, I'm sure.
Yeah. Now, musically speaking, this is the first point in time where we have a definitive aural link to the age that we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And if I had remembered my keyboard, I would play, a little bit of this, but the general gist is still going to be here. I'll just have to put the links on our show notes page. So check that out. This music, on a technical level, is rather simple. Mm-hmm. On the surface, the amount of control that is required for a singer to do this is remarkable. Mm-hmm. But that's not even the thing that astounds me the most. If you get a copy of these ancient books, if you've ever seen one, these songbooks are probably at least a foot thick.
Mm-hmm. They're huge.
These codexes would be memorized by the faithful, specifically the monks, priests, and nuns that worked within the churches themselves. It is one of the greatest acts of human memory in history to memorize the church calendar, what songs you sing at that time, what options you have, and to remind yourself of what those songs sounded like, even if you haven't sung them in a year and you're a child, or if you've sung them every year and you're an old man or woman.
Women weren't allowed to sing in the church.
Fair. No, even in the convent?
Not
for the service, but...
Yeah, probably not.
This is an area in which I'm woefully ignorant.
Certainly not allowed to perform anything.
That's fair. The basic underlying structure of these songs, however, are what we now refer to as modes. And basically, if you pause here and listen to me playing through the C major scale a couple of times during the episode that we did a couple of weeks ago on the Overtone series, that major scale, and I can do it da 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 da. That's probably not in C, but whatever. It's also not the most in tune thing. You can start a scale on every single one of those notes there.
Yeah. And wrap around when you get to the top.
Mm-hmm. Each one of those has a name. Mm-hmm. If I'm in C and I start on D, that's called D Dorian. If I start on G, that's Mixolydian. If I start on B, that's Locrian. We don't like the Locrian scale here. That's not true, but it's not. It's not
hate Locrian.
It is not a pleasant scale, shall we say?
In your opinion.
Well, I'm not big on metal, which seems to be where it survives today. Anyway, though, if this were a music theory class, I would definitely name all of them and their uses. I'm not going to do that. No one got time for that.
Dorian, Phrygian,
Ionian, Dorian. I guess now we have to do it now because Susan
just
started
quick,
counting.
Just real quick.
Dorian, Ionian, Dorian,
Phrygian,
Lydian, Mixolydian, Aeolian, Locrian.
Yeah. There you go.
But these scales apply for all 12 keys, which at the time there were actually more than 12 keys. There were, I believe, 16. I could be wrong about that.
Wild.
In which case, there were several notes that would kind of glom together when we tempered the instrument. Those would have been the missing scale, so you'd get like H. That's what.
Which, when we say H, we don't mean B natural, by the way.
Right. The scale of H. Yeah. I wonder what that would have sounded like. Anyway, though. If we look at a chant from this period, and I will quote it here, I'll put this on our show notes page. It's called Of the Father's Love Begotten. It's essentially an F major scale. Yeah, I'm glad you just know that. What she has done is all in the Ionian scale. Yes, until that part there. That is the Ionian scale. Thank you for that. With it, you could do a lot of things, because that's essentially our major scale today. It conveys a certain meaning. inherently because it's uplifting. It is a complete scale. It might be a little unstable at points, but there isn't anything that makes it stand out.
Mm-hmm.
Likewise, and I don't think we'll need to hum this one because you'll know it, if you think of the Dies Irae, which survives with us to this day, not just in chant form, not just in every single Requiem Mass written between, ever, and now, but it's also just, in general, become the sound of death. And it doesn't matter if it's a Mass or Tim Burton. Tim Burton wanting an eerie thing, and so he turns to Hans Zimmer and says, hey, do this thing, and it always comes out, bam, 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 no matter what it is. We've associated those. But that's the thing, that's the ethos. It's no longer just Day of Wrath. It is doom.
Sure.
And it gets appropriated by everybody.
Yeah.
My favorite being Hector Berlioz. Which, if you want an opium dream in which you kill your lover and then you actually marry her in real life and drive her crazy so she leaves you, you should check out Symphonie Fantastique.
Nobody wants that.
It's a fascinating story. Anyway, though, I've highlighted these two chants specifically because the tonality of both of them is central to their sound and their meaning. If we went through the entire catalog of plain chant, which would take us probably about 6 months.
Way too long.
Probably about 6 months of daily... Actually, no, much longer than that. Several
very
years
long time.
Of daily releases.
Mm-hmm.
Each one of these would have inherent meaning, not just in the text, not just in the notes, not just in the key. They would all be blended together to create a religiously transcendent moment, which is ultimately the goal of these people who are essentially working anonymously for thousands of years, or for not
8,000 of
8,000 of years, yes, really about 800 years.
Mm-hmm.
And it's tempting to go down this rabbit hole and see who contributed what to the thought process that's developing around this point in time. I'm not going to do that. My brain's not working for that. But what I would recommend specifically is looking into a school of thought known as scholasticism, which essentially boils everything down to Christianity explains everything. The most famous of these people that you've probably heard of is St. Thomas of Aquinas. He's also a little more liberal than some of the other philosophers at the time. But what we have here is essentially a religion that is dictating the way of life of over 1 million people, because I don't know what the population of Europe at that period of time would have been, and I'm sure it fluctuates from plague year to plague year.
I was going to say less and less,
but if we look at Christianity as a religion itself, it is a fusion of different ideas, all of which play out in the music, in the art, and in the philosophy. And to hit on them really quickly, you have the route coming from Jerusalem heading to Rome, essentially. You get the Jewish aspects, you get the Roman aspects, you get the Greek aspects, and you get some other cultures thrown in here and there that just added something as they go along the way. There are also traces of Stoicism, a good, healthy respect for the works of Aristotle, and, of course, the idea of the saints and the apostles, because they take up into that old Roman pantheon of lesser gods. Because that's part of the selling point of this religion, especially because at this point in time, even though Christianity had spread through the entire Roman Empire, it is not a dominant faith until roughly around the time of the Great Schism. The Celts add something,
Mm-hmm.
especially in Ireland.
Mm-hmm. No, the Celts are very easily converted in Ireland, and and you're absolutely right. I mean, every place that becomes converted has
Its own unique
parts of its religion, parts of its native religion brought into Christianity to make the transfer a little more palatable.
Yeah. Like, especially if you're looking at these differences at a macro view. Take Roman Catholicism, for example. The art coming out of Rome, out of Florence, out of Venice, well into the Baroque period, is very ornate. It's very emotive. It is very lively and colorful. Versus the Irish, who are much more interested in berating you for your sins. And I'm doing them a great disservice there.
It's true.
But there is more guilt associated in Irish Catholicism than Italian Catholicism. Next, we have the contributions of the individual apostles themselves, who essentially get put into the pantheon as demigods later on. Not really, but it is the same kind of structure in which the Roman and Greek model worked on.
I mean, the comparison can be drawn.
Although instead of worshiping them, you're asking them to intercede for you and just go up to the big guy and nudge him and say, hey, can you do this guy the favor? That was when I worked for the Catholic school. That was one of the first things I was reassured of. Was that the old...
They would all pray for you, intercede for you.
Yeah, essentially, we want you to know we don't worship Mary. We're just asking her to, go to the big guy and, nudge him a little bit for us.
I see.
Yeah. But each of the individual apostles contributes something, because Paul, who was originally Saul, essentially takes what was a burgeoning religion and puts it in his own image and his own opinions. Prior to Paul, Christianity was incredibly friendly for slaves.
A boatload of opinions.
It was a particularly friendly religion for slaves and women. And the early converts were those two groups. It's not until Paul comes in that we get some of the more... You're going to use the word. Go ahead and use it.
I was just going to say distasteful.
Okay,
but...
that's fine. That's fine. Your eyes said something else entirely.
Did they say misogynist? Because that's
fair.
Little bit what I was thinking.
But he also decides, you know what, I don't want to do the kosher thing. And for that, we thank you.
Yeah.
Now...
Bacon is good.
Lastly, we have compromises that are made between the Christians and the pagans. Because in order for...
Christmas trees.
Well, yeah, Christmas trees, amongst other things. And as we've already mentioned here, the saints, the apostles, these other groups, they begin to form something of a pantheon within Catholicism itself. And I'm sure I'm doing this religion a great disservice by referring it to it as that. But there are...
I certainly wouldn't like it.
Right, but there are certain structures that are similar between the pantheon of Greek gods and the way the Catholic Church is settled today.
Sure.
And that is... It just is what it is. This happens...
I mean, you can objectively draw that comparison, and you'd probably only piss off a few Catholics.
Right, and for, the most gratuitous example I'm going to use today, if you're familiar at all with Bertrand Russell, the philosopher... First of all, congratulations. I don't particularly enjoy reading him, but he's been a source for this program many times. He draws the comparison for what communism essentially does in the 19th century in Germany, as it's trying to grow and be accepted by more people than the 23 angry communists that Marx wrote the manifesto for in the 1840s. I wish I was being facetious there. There were 23 of them, and they were all angry. In 1848. So, I'm going to make the assumption that you are all relatively familiar with what the Marxist doctrine is, or at least in terms of their general goals.
I thought you were going to talk about that you were assuming that we were all relatively familiar with Bertrand Russell, and I was going to be like, whoa.
No. Side story, I was in our school's library today. I found his autobiography on the shelf, which I have no idea why it was. Well, I'm sure it was just brought over from the old school, and it would have been acquired in the 60s or 50s probably. But we were trying to ask ourselves, what would we modernize about the library? And I was walking through there. I'm like,
Take this out.
well, I mean, I'm going to steal this if this isn't like, if we don't do anything with it. But, do you know who this guy is? No? Yeah.
Nobody does.
Nobody unless you're a nerd like me. But
specific flavor of nerd.
So Russell's adaptation, or Russell's understanding of communism, I think does get particularly apt at certain points here. So God the Father becomes didactical materialism. Jesus becomes Marx himself. He will save you from your sins. The church is now the party. The elect, which is a Catholic philosophy or doctrine, well, really more Calvinist, becomes the proletariat. The second coming is now the revolution. Hell is what awaits the capitalists. And the millennium, which is when Christ was thought to return. Imagine they thinking that Christ was going to return in the year 1000.
A lot of the very early Christians thought he was going to return a lot sooner than that.
But the new millennium, the return of Christ, is now the communist utopia. Mm. So while it's not the cleanest of comparisons, this is something that we do. We latch onto something old, we put our new face on it, and we say, have at it. New belief system.
I made this.
Now, certain aspects of the new religion would be something of a middle ground. The Gnostics are particularly good at being the middle ground between pagan and Christian. But once the doctrine settles, they get stamped out. And the one thing, though, is that early Catholicism did not have images. They had to fix that for the pagans because they were very image-driven, but they were also illiterate.
Yeah.
And so art becomes the main method of story. Music becomes the main form of story in the Catholic Church for damn near 1,000 years. And so within that, we can largely group art into two branches here, secular and religious, which we always can. But they all share similar aspects, so much so that really, if you take out the individual spiritual aspects of religious art, the only way you can tell the difference between these two is religious art has a bunch of golden circles behind the heads of the people who are supposed to be holy.
Yeah, people are wearing white and gold and blue a lot.
Yeah, and they're taking their cues from the Byzantine Empire, in which it's gold, literal gold in the picture, and not just yellow trim.
Yeah, literal gold.
That's pretty much really that's about it. That's the separating line here. But if we look critically, as I've already alluded to here, it's almost like we've fallen backwards because we've lost the ability that the Greeks and Roman copyists by nature had that allowed them to create a three-dimensional space in art, in sculpture, in representation. And it takes us a little while to find that. Not that there aren't other art forms that developed during this period, but the old way of living, especially by 1000 AD, is definitely gone. But of course, if you have religious depictions in art, that means you have religious depictions in music. And I've kind of gotten sidetracked here a little bit, so I'm going to breeze through this really quickly. But what happens in the church during this period of time is music begins to become more harmonically complex. The first thing we do is we write a parallel line to the original one. Then the next thing we do is add a parallel line above the original one. That original line now becomes known as the tenor. Then we start to decide, well, what if we have this thing do its own thing over here? And then that follows along, but does its own thing. And what if we have more of that? So we get these 12-part things. Some of them are following the lines cleanly. Others of them are just kind of, going along. Not too dissimilar, actually, from, say, an African drumming circle, in which you have one idea that might have remained concept, or at least in concept, yeah. One idea might come back or be the original idea that you build off of, and then someone adds on top of it, and someone adds on top of it, until you get this glorious cacophony of sound in which everyone is working together to uplift one another. But the problem is, it got really stodgy after a while. And so the idea comes that what we can do is clean this up and depict the faith in writing itself. And this is where things get interesting, because if you don't know the spirituality behind this writing style, you just hear music. But there's a grouping of notes here that developed in about the 12th and 13th century, starting with a group of composers in France. Specifically, Philip de Vitry is the big name out of this one.
Cool.
And they decide that music needs to be more meaningful in the service of the faith. And so what they do is they start to depict the faith in musical notation. This is when we start to see the idea of ars nova, the new art. How can you reflect the glory and splendor of God in this austere manner? And their answer is to group notes together. And this is a substructure. Now, we know this, Susan and I know this as the perfectum, in which you have groupings of 3 and groupings of 2. The 3 grouping represents perfection because of the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. You can get da 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 da, and those are all important because those groupings of 2 were probably referring to some kind of reference to man, or they were unimportant words. The groupings of 3 would be the stressed emphasis. They would be the ones that would get brought out. But the thing is, it's a deeper structure than that.
Much.
This happens not just on the musical end, but on the harmonic end, on the page end. It is actually about 4 levels or 5 levels deep. And these ideas get represented in several different ways. Note values, melodic phrasing, rhythmic subdivision, and musical timing all tie together in the service of this art form. And there are a host of treatises on these ideas that remain with us today, specifically those by Philip de Vitry. But rather than getting into the specifics, we're going to just restate that every decision in music from about 1100, roughly, well, maybe a little later, until the Renaissance, is deliberate. It is as artistic as the art on the walls of these cathedrals where they are singing. It is
as intentional as the art on the walls of the cathedral being intended to teach people the stories from the Bible.
And as we mentioned, this is the era of the great Gothic cathedrals. You have Chartres, Notre Dame, Reims. I know I said that wrong. R-E-I-M-S. It's French. Reims. Thank you. I'm tired. England, you see the rebuilt Canterbury Cathedral, joining the Lincoln and Salisbury cathedrals. And in many ways, these massive spaces mirrored the caves of old that their ancestors had wandered into miles deep into a network of caves to find the most resonant spot. And they're creating it for themselves here, in a specific location in Europe, not too far away, in some cases, from these ancient structures. Which also goes to tell you how tied to the land people really were.
Oh, yeah.
But that's a completely different story. Now, we are going to be wrapping things up here, but I did promise that we'd get to the Crusades. So, rather than getting into the whole thing about the Crusades, the Crusades and the Great Schism, because there is a good deal of difference between the Catholic Church and the now Orthodox Church. A lot of this seems rather trivial to us today. But
Fun fact, both the words Catholic and Orthodox both mean universal.
So, to show you how silly some of these things were, one of the things that they broke up over was whether or not to use unleavened bread.
Very important.
I mean, yeah, especially if you're coming from the Jewish tradition where you don't have lead bread,
right.
But some people don't care, some people did care.
Yeah.
Or the wording of the Nicene Creed. But regardless, the Pope and the head of the Greek Orthodox Church, as we refer to it now, excommunicated one another from their
Church.
Eastern Orthodox. They excommunicated one another from their respective services in a divide that would last literally until the 20th century.
And still, I mean,
the churches won't unify.
No.
But they're at least no longer excommunicated.
Oh, sure. Good.
Every successive pope has been excommunicated until the 20th century.
That's very funny.
But
very funny.
When the Orthodox Christians came asking for help, they got it from the Catholics. The only thing is, they wanted help defending Constantinople, and the Pope said, "Retake the Holy Land!" Oh, okay.
Sorry about that.
It's not too different than, like, Hitler wanting to invade Russia earlier than he did, but Mussolini showed up. He's like, yes, and now we march to Africa. Like, but I had plans in Russia. To the Holy Land! But the centuries of religious crusades that happened between, really until the 1600s in some scale. Mm-hmm. What they do is they reopen lines of trade that had been shut down for hundreds of years. Mm-hmm. And they reintroduce the West to not only the Ottomans, who had risen as the West was trying to restructure itself, but also to China, to India. The world is reopening at this point in time, and it's all about to happen, or it's going to eventually culminate first in the Renaissance, but eventually in the Age of Reason and the Age of Enlightenment. But before we can get to that point, there is a spread of cultural ideas and goods that make their way back to Europe that do rapidly reshape the continent. Mm-hmm. The idea of courtly love, for example, the main driving tale of one of our main understandings of the Arthurian legend, in which Lancelot and Guinevere love each other. They can't really do anything about it, but they're still going to, sneak off, but it's okay because they're in love. Yeah. That is not a European concept.
No.
That is an Arabic concept. Mm-hmm. And that reshapes music, because the troubadours who come out of France are greatly influenced by the Moors who are residing in Spain. And while they're hanging out in Al-Nusra, I believe as it was known at the time, the Jews, Christians, and Islam were getting along with each other and sharing ideas and creating a culture that was remarkably dynamic that we don't really talk about too much. But the rhythm of, say, the oud, I think I'm saying that properly, I'm probably not, but, if anyone wants to correct me on any of this, send us an email at intimepod@gmail.com. Please do. I welcome being corrected. But it gets translated into the lute. Mm-hmm. And we begin to get rhythm entering things again. And it's no longer a flowing rhythm. The music is no longer a flowing stream. It's now getting jagged. It's getting lively. It's more, dare I say it, danceable.
Oh, snap. Nope, we can't talk about dancing.
Can't talk about dancing.
Taboo.
We're in that town in Footloose.
Nope.
But what the Crusades do manage to do is reintroduce the world to each other, to itself. And it begins to form, eventually, the global village that we essentially live in today.
It's a lot more complicated than that.
Well, yes, there are plenty of, Vikings invading things and, plague and the 30 Years' War, the 100 Years' War, the War of Spanish Succession.
Et cetera,
there's a bunch of stuff that happens between
Habsburgs.
Then and now. But the seeds for that world, that reconnection, are sown because of an overzealous campaign to retake the Holy Land. Mm. And by extension, music itself is going to rapidly change. But that is going to have to wait till next week, when a rebirth begins in the European lands. This has been In Time, a music history podcast. I'm your host, Zachary Singer.
And I'm Susan Zeringer.
If you like what you heard today, like, subscribe, and leave us a review. Check out our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram pages, all at In Time Pod. And head on over to our website, intimepod.com, where you'll find detailed show notes for this and every show, as well as a donate feature, which, should you choose to make a one-time donation of $1, $5, $10, $15, or $20, you will greatly help us to improve our show's infrastructure. And we're asking you to do this not because I want to, buy a new shirt or a car or pay my mortgage.
Please donate $5 to help Zach buy a new shirt. He only has 2. That's a lie. You've seen him in more than 2 shirts. Anyway.
It is to bring you the program that you deserve. Until next week, remember to stay in time. In Time, a music history podcast, is a Timekeepers production and is written, recorded, edited, and produced by the hosts. Be sure to check out our social media accounts, all at InTimePod, and head on over to intimepod.com, where you'll find show notes and bonus material for your entertainment and continued education. Until next week, once again, remember to stay in time.